Welcome to KAKOVISION, a podcast to pump you up to change the world. Hosted by me, Jordana. Let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to KAKOVISION with Jordana. On this episode, we're going to talk about bankruptcy and homelessness. So if you're new to this show, this podcast talks about how America has become a world divided by haves and have-nots, and how billionaires and special interests got together and had this long-term strategy over decades to shift the political system in the United States and to use it for their best interests, and how they have been wildly successful in their initiatives and how it impacts every different aspect of life. So in this case, we're talking about bankruptcy, homelessness. There was a Supreme Court decision in 1978, which basically deregulated consumer credit cards. This allowed the credit card industry to get consumers in this cycle where they're stuck in fees and paying off the interest payments. So this started happening. And then what the credit card industry didn't want to happen was for people to be able to declare bankruptcy and then get their credit card debt wiped out. So then there was effort to change our bankruptcy system. And in 2005, that happened. So then lobbyists started going after our bankruptcy laws and urged Congress to pass the Bankruptcy Abuse Protection and Consumer Protection Act in 2005. So this was really trying to deter people from pursuing bankruptcy. So it made it much harder and more expensive. And it limited the types of debt that are dischargeable. In the 2 years since the BAPCPA, or the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act, passed, bankruptcy filings cut in half, and disproportionately, the lower and middle income people were declaring bankruptcy at a much lower rate. So people who were hit with an unexpected and uninsured hospitalization, those people filing bankruptcy dropped by 70% in the 2 years following this reform. So the people who really needed it are not getting it. But the rich are still finding ways to game the system. As long as you have money, you can game the bankruptcy system. As long as you have a team of experts who can tell you how to best move your money around, you'll be all right. But most of the country does not fall into that category. So when bankruptcy costs $1,000 up front, it's not something that's obtainable to most people. And so there's two different types of bankruptcy. One is Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and the other is Chapter 13 bankruptcy. And Chapter 7 costs more up front. And this is the type of bankruptcy that we all kind of think about, where you declare bankruptcy, any big significant assets are sold off, and you start over. Chapter 13, law firms advertise that there's no initial payment, but ultimately it ends up costing more than 3 times much in the long run. And the success rate is low because in Chapter 13, it's more of a reorganization. And if you come up with a payment plan, and if you make every single one of those payments, then your debt is discharged. But if there is one hiccup, you're SOL. So after that 2005 Bankruptcy Act, bankruptcies in lower middle income families dropped disproportionate to those in wealthy families. And in the Utopia versus Dystopia video, show an example. This clip will resurface in another video on long-term care facilities. But this woman was on a millionaires matchmaker type of show. And she was talking about how she loves working with the elderly, and she opened assisted living facilities, and she was worth between $3 and $4 million. The assisted living facilities had a whole slew of issues, which we'll talk more about in the episode on how we treat our seniors. But ultimately, the state of California banned this woman for life from operating a long-term care facility and ordered her and her company to pay $1.6 million in unpaid wages and penalties. So she decides to file bankruptcy. She has to pay a fraction of the verdict that she was supposed to pay for unpaid wages and penalties. She kept her beautiful house. Her dad bought the assisted living facility, so it's still in their family. And she was still, as of the taping of this show, which was a couple of years ago, she was still listed as the CEO of the company. Bankruptcy on one end is this hurdle that you could so easily misstep and have to start all over again. Or at the other end, bankruptcy is just a tool to discharge liabilities. And it's sick. Since this podcast is new, we have no sponsors. So I will shamelessly plug Kako. And if you get sick of hearing this, then reach out to become a sponsor.
Kako, the social app. Kako, the social app. Kako, the social app. Kako rules. Kako, the social app. Billionaire greed. Kako, the social app. Destroying America. Kako, the social app. T-minus 7 years and counting. Kako, the social app.
And with that, let's get back to the show. Hi, and welcome back. So before the break, we talked about bankruptcy and how the late 1970s started a period of deregulation for the credit card industry, consumer debt ballooned, then lobbyists, special interests worked on our bankruptcy laws to make it harder and to make it less advantageous to try to dispose of your debt in this way. So now let's shift and talk about homelessness for a minute. So in 1933, it was estimated that we had 1 million people homeless. So that's right in the middle of the Great Depression. Things were really, really difficult. In response to the situation that everybody was in, the government stepped in. They had jobs and affordable housing programs. They enacted Social Security. A little later, the GI Bill. By the end of World War II, homelessness really didn't exist in the United States. And all the way through that same period, late 70s, early 80s, it stayed like that because the US government prioritized people having a roof over their head. And homelessness and poverty are different. You can be poor but still have a house, be protected from the elements, have an address where you can have mail sent, which makes it much easier to get a job. From 1978 to 1983, the financial housing budget went from $83 billion to $18 billion. And the cuts have never been restored. So from that point on, homelessness has been increasing and it has been skyrocketing in recent years. I am incredibly lucky that I don't have to worry about these particular problems. And because of that, I'm able to put my time and energy into trying to share this material with you. I have a safety net, and I am blessed. The beginning of COVID and being out of the corporate world and living in a very expensive place in Central Jersey, I had considered putting my home on the market and moving someplace that had a lower cost of living. And the downside of that is that right now I live a mile away from my brother and a mile away from my mom. Moving far away from them would definitely be difficult. And my mom didn't want to see that happen. And so she has been helping me so I can afford to stay in this area. I recognized how privileged I am to be in this situation. And I feel like if I am not going to step up and do something and try to create change, knowing that I will never be out on the street, then who will? I've let people stay with me when they've had no other places to stay. The first time I did this, I had to have been 18 or 19 years old. My friend, who was a year older, got kicked out of his parents' place. So he was probably 19, 20, just did not get his shit together. His parents, one of them, an insurance executive, just like my mom. And he moved in. He moved in for a couple of months. And then ultimately he enlisted and he had a child. And he was the first person that I knew very, very close that killed themselves. Before that point, I had been to a friend's sister's funeral and she had hung herself, and that was awful. She was a teenager. But this was the first time it was my friend. Or my old friend. And I had been to my cousin's funeral. He had died of a drug overdose. And this old high school friend, years later, took a shotgun and shot himself. Now, I had had a falling out with this friend years before he took his life. He had stolen from me, and that was it. But I can tell you, a lot of times before somebody takes that final act, they do some shitty things. And there are multiple friends where I gave up on them and then they died. And I can't tell you how shitty that feels. It happened to one of my bridesmaids. She was falling apart. At some point, I stepped back and then she was gone. So I know it's not anybody's fault and there's no way to save everybody. But I'm telling you that it feels really shitty when somebody dies and when you knew that they were struggling and you couldn't, whatever the situation was, get them the help that they needed. Right now, just about every state has lifted the ban on evictions. The Supreme Court struck it down at a national level, and just about all states have followed. So you're going to see a mass eviction waves. And it is very hard for people to find a new place to live if they've got crappy credit. This problem happened with Paul when he was living here, and nothing really having to do with our relationship with each other, but just with his two kids, my two kids, trying to get my work done. And, it took him months to get out of my house. And only when I kicked him out and basically made him homeless there was a good month or two where he didn't really have a residence. His kids didn't really have a residence. And they are in the process of getting kicked out of their school. One of his kids has been having mental health issues. It's awful. We need to have a better system in place. We need to care about the people in this country as well as throughout the world. It's all about priorities. When we prioritized housing, we did away with homelessness. When it's not a priority, it's out of control. And when we write the rules to favor those who already have money and to funnel the gains of society up instead of distribute them widely, this is what's going to happen. And it's not just in bankruptcy, it's not just in homelessness, it's in every aspect of life. It touches everything. So that's it for this episode of KAKOVISION. If you haven't checked out the Utopia versus Dystopia series, where there's videos and it's not me just rambling, or the intro series for the podcast, definitely check those out. The intro series talks about Kako and Kakao technologies and how if we don't want the financial gains of progress to be concentrated at the very, very top, how we need to come together and get enough people and create our own rules and use technology to solve problems and to create a way where people can easily contribute and live comfortably and create a world where people want to live and they don't want to kill themselves. So that's it for today. I'll see you next Tuesday.
Kako the social app. Kako the social app. Kako the social app. Kako rules. Kako the social app. Billionaire greed. Kako the social app. Destroying America. Kako the social app. T-minus 7 years and counting. Kako the social app.